Hey, Mike here. I just wanted to let you know that you can listen to Dark Poutine early and ad-free on Amazon Music, included with Prime.
Okay, welcome back to Dark Poutine. I am Mike Brown.
And I'm Matt.
Here in Langley, British Columbia.
Look at me, I'm so excited to jump in. And I'm Matthew, here in Vancouver.
Hi, Matthew.
Hi. You might hear a little bit of scratching. So Steve is very happy that I'm home. So he's on the bed with me, and he's right now making biscuits to settle in.
He's got his cone of shame on, I noticed.
He does.
Why is that?
His corneal ulcer, his eye is still sore, and he started scratching it now. So it's not a good thing.
Poor Steve.
Yeah.
The views, information, and opinions expressed during the Dark Poutine podcast are solely those of the producer and do not necessarily represent those of Curious Cast, its affiliate, Global News, nor their parent company, Chorus Entertainment.
Dark Poutine is not for the faint of heart or squeamish. Listener discretion is strongly advised. We're not experts on the topics we present, nor are we journalists. We're two ordinary Canadian schmucks chatting about crime and the dark side of history. Let's get to it. Put on your toque, grab yourself a double-double and a Nanaimo bar. It's time to scarf down some Dark Poutine.
You are responsible for obtaining and maintaining at your own cost all equipment needed to listen to Dark Poutine. Dark Poutine can be addictive. Side effects may include, but not be limited to, pausing and questioning the system, elevated heart rate, pondering humanity, odd looks from colleagues as you laugh out loud at work, family members not into true crime worrying about you. Positive side effects may include some perspectives and opinions that you disagree with, as well as some wokeness and empathy. If you don't think Dark Poutine is for you, consult your doctor immediately.
On the evening of February 14th, 1985, Valentine's Day at around 6 p.m., Bryan Hart of Colborne, Ontario came home to find a quiet house after work. He looked around the home for his wife Betty, but could not find her. The couple's 19-year-old son Michael had already been home for an hour and a half, and Michael said he hadn't seen his mum either and presumed she had gone out somewhere. However, he had noticed a pair of glasses she wore sitting on the landing leading to the basement. Michael had picked up the glasses and put them on top of the refrigerator in the kitchen for safekeeping. On learning about the glasses, Bryan felt compelled to go check the basement. It was the only place he hadn't checked yet. In the cellar, Bryan Hart discovered Betty, his wife, lying on her side in a vast pool of blood. She was unresponsive. Bryan raced back upstairs and told his son to call an ambulance. Marguerite Elizabeth Betty Hart, 46, was dead. Among Betty's many injuries, her throat had been slashed. Early on, the OPP presumed Betty's wounds to be self-inflicted, but not all was as it appeared. This is Dark Poutine episode 337, Valentine's Day Nightmare, the murder of Betty Hart. Colborne, Ontario is in Cramahe Township, Northumberland County. It is about 140 kilometers east of Toronto and 25 kilometers west of Belleville, along the northern shores of Lake Ontario. Situated near Highway 401, Colborne is accessible from major cities like Toronto and Kingston. It has long been known for its rich agricultural heritage, particularly apple orchards, and is home to the iconic roadside attraction, the Big Apple. This iconic structure, shaped like a giant red apple, stands 10.7 meters, 35 feet tall, and is a popular tourist destination along Highway 101. The Big Apple was constructed in 1987 as a part of a larger complex with a restaurant, bakery, and a gift shop. The attraction was designed to capitalize on the area's reputation for apple production, particularly the Northern Spy variety, which was once widely grown in the region. Over the years, the Big Apple has become a beloved landmark, drawing visitors who stop to admire its unique architecture, enjoy apple-themed treats, and take memorable photographs. The site has expanded to offer amenities such as mini golf and a petting zoo, enhancing its appeal as a family-friendly destination. Despite changes in ownership and renovations throughout its history, the Big Apple remains an enduring symbol of Colborne's agricultural heritage and a testament to the enduring charm of roadside Americana in Canada.
Otherwise known as Canadiana.
Canadiana, yes, exactly. Where Diane is from, my birth mom is from Berwick, Nova Scotia, and they have a Big Apple in Berwick as well, but it's nowhere near as large as the Big Apple there in Colborne. Long before European settlers arrived, the area surrounding Colborne was home to indigenous peoples, notably the Mississauga Nation, who are a part of the larger Anishinaabe group. These communities lived in the region for thousands of years, engaging in hunting, fishing, agriculture, and trade along the shores of Lake Ontario. They had complex systems of governance and deep spiritual connection to the land. The arrival of European settlers in the early 19th century disrupted indigenous life as lands were gradually ceded through treaties and settlement expanded. Colborne itself was founded in 1819 and named after Sir John Colborne, the Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada. The village grew quickly, becoming an essential stop along the stagecoach route between Kingston and York, now Toronto. The construction of the Grand Trunk Railway, not the Grand Funk Railroad, that's a 70s band, in the mid-1800s further spurred economic growth, transforming the village into an agricultural and transportation hub.
I went to Colborne Street Public School in Strathroy.
Oh, well, there you go.
And I never thought of it, but I'm assuming it was named after him as well. And because Colborne is way up past Oshawa, so that's a 4-hour drive. But he was a lieutenant governor of Upper Canada, so
right,
also known as Ontario.
Yes.
So I imagine it's the same name. And then this got me thinking when I was reading the script. And yeah, almost every town in Ontario has a Colborne Street, like Strathroy, Toronto, Brantford, Kingston, London, Bellevue, Goderich, Hamilton, Port Stanley, Cambridge. The list just kept going on.
Wow.
I think almost every town has a Colborne Street.
Yeah, I wonder if he was like, well, you could name a street after me.
We'll give you extra provincial funding if you name a street after me.
Yeah, I don't have an ego, but you can name a street after me. As for crime, Colborne's small-town character meant that it had relatively low crime rates compared to larger urban areas. Local policing typically dealt with petty crimes like theft and minor disturbances. However, by the early 1980s, like many rural Ontario towns, Colborne began seeing occasional more serious incidents, partly due to growing mobility and urban-rural connections. There isn't a significant record of major criminal events specifically in Colborne leading up to 1985. Still, like others in the region, the town would have been influenced by broader social changes and crime trends in Ontario at the time. While looking into Betty Hart's death, OPP investigators had to deal with a gruesome crime scene and spent several days in the basement at 41 Church Street East. 3 hours after Bryan discovered Betty's body, the police forensics team collected a 4-piece section of a utility knife lying 2 feet from Betty's head in her blood. 2 days later, under a piece of furniture, they found another 7-piece section of utility knife blade. An expert later determined that the 2 pieces of evidence had been together at one point, part of the same blade series. Although blood was not visible on the second blade section found, it was later confirmed to be present in the forensics lab. Violent deaths were an aberration in Colborne in 1985, and they still are. It's a relatively sleepy place where not much happens out of the ordinary. The township has not grown very much since 1985, when the population was just over 1,200. As of the 2021 census, slightly more than 1,400 people call it home. As with all small towns, people talk when something terrible happens. Everyone has a theory, and sometimes those theories might contain clues about the truth of what happened. Word of Betty Hart's brutal death spread like wildfire. Dr. John Jack Harold Whiteside, an experienced pathologist, performed the autopsy on Betty the day after her death. According to court documents, Dr. Whiteside, quote, found 4 bruises to the head. There was a bruise on the top of the head and one at the back of the head. There was a bruise on each temple. There were small abrasions around both eyes. There were also bruises around the chin area on the left side and 2 small scrapes to the left side of the mouth. There was a small amount of bleeding inside the skull, indicating a minor concussion, which probably would not produce unconsciousness. There were a number of deep slashes, as well as some superficial ones, to the front of the neck, extending from the left side to the right ear. There were at least 6 deep cuts. The deepest cuts were just below the thyroid cartilage, known as the Adam's apple. 2 of these cuts had severed the windpipe, which had receded into the chest. The cause of death was the severance of the trachea or windpipe in combination with the resulting hemorrhage. In Dr. Whiteside's opinion, the injuries to the throat would have to be caused by a sharp knife. There was also a horizontal cut across the lower part of the left wrist and another cut at an angle about the mid-forearm. There were cuts on the middle finger, the ring finger, and the little finger on the left hand that were consistent with being made by a knife. The cuts to the fingers of the right hand were more extensive and severe than those to the left hand. There were 6 cuts to the ring finger, 3 to the middle finger, and 1 on the little finger. There was also an irregular slash on the palm of the right hand. End quote. Dr. Whiteside did not believe that Betty's injuries were self-inflicted, but investigators seemed to think otherwise. It was unclear to them whether or not Betty had died by suicide. Bryan, the couple's son Michael, and recently married daughter Michelle could not conceive of anyone wanting to hurt Betty Hart. Bryan Hart said things were going well for him and Betty, especially since he'd recently quit drinking. He said their marriage had been on an upswing.
I have an opinion about this. I think police should be maybe more cautious about saying that if somebody has died that it's self-inflicted, because especially when they really don't know yet, because first of all, I think that causes a great deal of distress for family and friends, right? And just to be blurting that out at the beginning probably isn't a good thing. And then secondly, when police make a statement like that, something often happens where they feel like they need to hold on to that, right? And this is a critical time trying to find perpetrators. And if you let that initial thought solidify without what do we call it? Pathological evidence? Without the
pathology,
without the pathology, then it's human nature. You get on a track. And at the very beginning is an important time to be looking for evidence and for perpetrators, right? So I just feel like sometimes I've seen in other cases it seems a little bit to jump the gun at stating that somebody's killed themselves or did a murder-suicide, and then you find out later that that's not the case.
News articles said that Betty Hart was a vibrant and energetic woman deeply devoted to her 2 children, Michael and Michelle. She was known for her humor and the joy she brought to conversations, all while contributing significantly to her community. Alongside her full-time job at Bell Canada, she managed to maintain a warm and welcoming home, while also caring for her parents, George and Mildred Latimer. Her father had been disabled by a stroke 15 years prior, and her mother had become disabled due to a kidney ailment 4 years before Betty's death. Betty remained closely involved in their care, never missing a day without being in contact with them. Beyond her family responsibilities, Betty worked selflessly for others. She volunteered as a driver for the Canadian Cancer Society, transporting patients to Princess Margaret Hospital in Toronto. She also canvassed for the Heart Foundation and the Arthritis Society. She worked with disadvantaged women at the Bialek Home in Colborne, supporting those needing special care. Her compassion was further demonstrated by her experience working with intellectually challenged adults during her time at Ontario Hospital. Betty's contributions to her family and the community left an enduring impact. Sure, she was a busy lady and she'd taken antidepressants before, but she didn't seem at all suicidal in the days and weeks leading up to her death. Betty's wounds were so awful. How could she have done that to herself, people thought. Police began talking to everybody who'd known Betty or had been connected to her in any way. Many of them described her as kind, social, happy-go-lucky, and without an enemy in the world. At the time she died, Betty had been working as a telephone operator for Bell, as we mentioned. Betty had been busy on Thursday, February 14th, the day of her death. In the morning, Betty went to her dad's house. They were neighbors. The pair went to the post office and a store. At some point in the morning, Betty spoke with a friend and joked about how much she wished she'd seen her husband Bryan's face when he discovered the Valentine she'd snuck into his lunch pail that morning. Around noon, Betty called a coworker to ask about her upcoming work schedule for the next week. Betty told the coworker she was excited about going away for the weekend. At 12:15, Betty's dad had another visitor, Betty's dog. Her dad tried calling Betty's house a few times, but no one answered the phone. He wanted to let Betty know where the dog was. One of the people the OPP detective spoke to was Betty's longtime friend and former business partner, Donald Philip Moran. Moran was a school bus driver and raised livestock on his property, including chickens. According to court documents, on February 18th, OPP Constable Phelan told Donald Moran that they were investigating Betty Hart's death and they wanted to talk to him to see if he could help. Moran said he'd be glad to lend a hand and agreed to come in for an interview. An hour after the phone call, Donald Moran was in an interview room with Constable Phelan and Corporal Collicott at the OPP detachment in Colborne. As the interview began, Moran claimed that he had a secret and that as police would eventually find out, he might as well tell them. Donald Moran told the officers that not only had he and Betty Hart been friends and business partners, but they'd also been having a secret sexual affair since 1972. Moran said that neither his wife nor Bryan Hart knew of the affair. Moran said that he and Betty had met for lunch on February 13th in Port Hope. He said that Betty seemed upset and depressed. Moran claimed that she asked him whether or not an insurance payout would come if someone died by suicide. Donald said that he told Betty not to talk that way. After lunch, during a drive together, he claimed that Betty had confided in him that she did not think life was worth living, and he said that he hadn't seen Betty at all on Valentine's Day.
Alarm bells are ringing already for me here.
Yeah.
I just get the sense that he's painting a picture.
You think? Near the end of the interview, Corporal Collicott asked if he could account Corporal Collicott asked Donald if he could account for his time between noon and 3 p.m. on the day of Betty's death. He said no, not really. He had no one who could corroborate his whereabouts. When asked whether he would submit to a polygraph examination if necessary, Moran said that he would be happy to do anything to help. As the conversation ended, Constable Phelan thanked Donald and told him that a coroner's inquest would soon be held. Phelan continued delicately, stating that as Donald Moran's wife was unaware of the affair that he'd had with Betty, it would be a good idea to tell her before it came out at the inquest. Constable Phelan later said that at this point, he was leaning towards suicide as a manner of Betty Hart's death, and Donald Moran was not a suspect. For clarification, both Bryan and Michael Hart had also been asked if they too would be willing to take polygraph tests, and neither of them was suspected of any wrongdoing. On February 22, 1985, Donald Moran got another call from Constable Phelan asking him to come into the office again. Inspector Collins wanted to go over the interview they had done on February 18th, just to clear some things up. So Donald headed to the OPP office in Colborne once again and arrived at around 10 a.m. During their meeting, Donald brought up something he hadn't mentioned before. He talked about an alarming incident from February 13th when Betty Hart tried to jump out of his moving car when he was doing about 40 to 50 miles an hour. That's around 80 kilometers. He managed to grab her and hold tight while he stopped the car. He also mentioned that before she tried to jump, she had thrown her glasses onto the dashboard, something she'd done several times before. Afterward, he said, she apologized, and Donald felt she seemed to have calmed down when they parted ways.
So more alarm bells for me here.
Yeah, more picture painting.
He's painting a story here, and really interesting that he focused on the glasses as well.
Right.
Because remember, the glasses were on the floor, and potentially he realized he had touched them or something.
Maybe.
Right?
Yeah. When Inspector Collins asked him about February 14th, Donald said he spent the day at home between the morning and afternoon school bus runs. He explained that it was pretty typical for Betty to call him in the morning after finishing his morning run. However, when Collins asked if she had called that morning, Donald said he wasn't expecting a call because he thought she was going to Toronto with her mom. When Collins pressed him again, Donald stuck to his story that he hadn't heard from her. Considering their relationship and what had happened the day before, Collins found this a bit strange. He kept asking Donald if there was any chance Betty might have called him and if he had gone over to her place afterward. Donald kept saying no, but then Collins suggested that if Betty had called and sounded upset, Donald should let him know if he went to check on her. That's when Donald finally admitted that something did happen. Donald explained that he did get a call from Betty around 12:15 or 12:30 where she was screaming and then hung up on him. Worried, he rushed over to her house. When he got there and walked in through the back door, he said he noticed a flower pot knocked over on the step. He went down to the basement and found Betty on the floor with a lot of blood around her. Feeling overwhelmed by what he saw, he panicked and left the house, heading straight home. Donald had now placed himself at the Harts home on the day of Betty's death, but according to court documents, the OPP investigators still did not consider him a suspect. It was understandable that a man who'd been having a long-term, clandestine affair with a woman he'd found laying dead in a pool of blood would want to distance himself. Perhaps Betty really had died by suicide, feeling depressed and guilty about the extended affair she'd had with Donald behind her husband's back. To be thorough, the police kept digging. There were more interviews to be done. Soon, however, a considerable development drove the investigation in another direction. More after a quick break. And we are back. We're halfway through, Matthew.
We're halfway through, and I'm already calling it.
Yeah.
This guy's way too dodgy. He's so obvious. And I wrote this, by the way, before I read the entire script.
Right.
So obviously trying to lead the Popo to the conclusion that she killed herself. And his problem is just like that we see so often. He didn't know when to STFU.
Yeah.
And he just kept talking, right?
Of course he did.
They never know when to stop, which is good. Is good, but wow, I'd be a much better criminal.
You might think so, but this case really reminds me of something. Specifically, Donald Moran's behavior after Betty Hart's death. It reminds me of one of my favorite books, Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. In the novel, a man named Raskolnikov, a student, believes he's above the law and kills a pawnbroker to test his theory, thinking the ends justify the means. But after the murder, he's consumed by guilt, even though he tries to rationalize it. His conscience eats away at him, causing paranoia and illness. Ultimately, it's not fear of punishment, but the weight of his guilt that drives him to confess. It's a powerful portrayal of how guilt can unravel even the most carefully thought-out plans. But this wasn't going to be straightforward. Something strange came to light in the weeks after Betty's death. Someone who claimed to be a second victim of Betty Hart's killer. On Saturday, March 9th, 1985, the Toronto Star reported that 18-year-old Sue Mallory from nearby Trenton, Ontario, had claimed she was attacked on a side street in Colborne on March 6th. Sue Mallory said she'd had 2 strange phone calls earlier in the week. The man on the line had called himself Betty and, Sue said, oddly, he'd also referred to her as Betty. She said a note was attached to the windshield when she'd gone to her car near her home in Wooler on Tuesday the 5th. It read, quote, "Betty was first. You're next." End quote. Mallory told the Star that she'd called the police, who had told her not to go out alone after dark. Terrified to be alone, Betty said she went to stay overnight with her boyfriend and his parents in Colborne. The following day, as she walked to a nearby store, she felt like someone was following her, but when she turned around, no one was there. She kept walking, but suddenly a man jumped her from behind and shoved her down. The man, wearing an olive green ski mask, wrapped a rope around her throat and started strangling her, laughing as he did. A passing car had startled the man, and he'd fled. Mallory complained the police took 3 hours to respond to her phone call for help. The Star reported that the OPP told them that the response was more like an hour and 45 minutes after her call, and the officers felt it was more important to track a suspect than to interview a victim. Mallory claimed that a dozen long-stemmed red roses had been sent to her house the day after the attack. Attached was a get-well card signed, Betty. Learning of the second attack and its possible connections to Betty Hart's death, people in the region were terrified. Some stepped up security in their homes, buying new locks and leaving lights on at night. Girls and women started looking over their shoulders, if they were brave enough to go out at all. It was later determined that Sue Mallory had made up the entire elaborate story. She was charged with mischief and later convicted. She was sentenced to 3 years of probation, fined $3,800, quote, to cover the cost of the hoax, end quote, and ordered to seek psychiatric help. The whole affair had been a distraction that the OPP did not need.
Thanks a lot, Sue.
Yeah, what an asshole. I understand that people are messed up and those kind of things, but when it's, they're dealing with something like this where family is really concerned and doesn't know what happened to their mom, sister, brother, whatever, whoever.
And somebody wants attention.
Yeah, it's gross. In the meantime, the OPP had gathered some more information that disturbed them and gave them pause about the seemingly helpful Donald Philip Moran. Matthew and I already know where this is going.
We'd be great investigators.
Charles Pattison, Betty Hart's brother-in-law, was suspicious of Donald. He'd been acting hinky. Pattison said that at Betty's funeral and the days after her death, he seemed upbeat, elated maybe. Rather than share anecdotes about Betty, Moran wanted to discuss everything he had, quote, done for her. Another funeral goer had said that Moran was cool as a cucumber and unemotional. Another noticed a large, fresh, and unbandaged cut on his hand.
Two things. First, what does hinky mean?
Well, hinky is like weird and...
I've never heard that word before.
Somebody acting strange or suspicious.
Is that your local dialect, Mike?
No, that's kind of a true crime thing.
Okay, hinky.
Yep. Yeah, hinky.
I guess after a couple of years, I'm still getting the true crime.
You're getting the lingo.
The lingo down. Okay, and then my second point here is the police didn't notice a large, fresh, unbandaged cut on his hand.
See, this is the thing. We don't know what the police knew. What the police wrote down in their reports and what they were actually talking about behind closed doors may be two different things.
And most likely not, though, unfortunately.
Yeah, maybe they were dum-dums.
No, Policing 101. I mean, this is 1985, did we say? Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, okay, yeah, forensic stuff, and like a lot has been learned, and I don't want to say how long ago that was because it makes me feel old.
Yeah.
But 101, you take a good hard look at intimate partners first. Mm-hmm. Right? And they don't...
Well, they've talked to him 2 times.
Yeah, but...
Yeah, I know.
I would love to give them the benefit of the doubt, but I'm not feeling it.
I can't wrap my brain around this one and how it shakes out. It just something doesn't make sense to me. It's very weird that it took this long.
And there's no big dun-da-da-da, this is what they were really doing.
Yeah. In a later discussion around the time of the funeral, when Pattison disputed the police's theory of suicide, Moran became visibly agitated, wringing his hands and leaving suddenly, saying he had chores to do in his barn. With this information in mind, the investigators wanted another look at the evidence. They returned to pathologist Dr. Whiteside's opinions that Betty's wounds had not been self-inflicted. Dr. Whiteside said that he had never seen injuries as severe or extensive as the one suffered by Betty. From court documents, quote, "The injuries on Betty's hands, in his opinion, were consistent with grabbing a knife and pulling it away. He believed it was impossible for Betty to have inflicted the injuries to the throat, head, face, and hands on herself. He surmised that when the injuries to the throat were sustained by Betty, she was being held from behind with the head extended back." End quote. Dr. Whiteside also said that the injuries to Betty's throat were so severe that he would not expect a person to remain conscious for much more than a minute after sustaining the injury to the trachea. End quote. As I researched this episode, I had a little trouble, as I mentioned, wrapping my head around the determination of suicide in the first place. All this evidence was available from the post-mortem done the day after Betty's death. Was the whole thing a ruse meant to flush Betty's killer out of the shadows, as it ultimately did? On March 12th, the OPP executed a search warrant for Donald Philip Moran's property. The search warrant encompassed Moran's, quote, residence, outbuildings, receptacles, and vehicles at 114 King Street East in the village of Colborne, end quote. They searched diligently for the next 2 days, scouring the property for relevant evidence. Again, from court documents, quote, on March 14, 1985, Constable Buchanan, around 9:30 a.m., found the handle of a utility knife containing a section of blade on top of a chest of drawers behind a number of sheets of plywood in Moran's drive shed. The section of the blade found inside the handle and the 2 sections of blade found in the basement of Betty Hart's home had at one time been part of the same blade. Tests disclosed the presence of blood in a groove inside the handle that was consistent with Betty Hart's, end quote. On March 14th, as they were searching Moran's property, the OPP announced to the press that Betty Hart's death had now been classified a homicide. As the search warrant expired at 9 p.m. on March 14th, the OPP pretended to withdraw from Moran's property. Unknown to him, 2 officers had been secreted inside a van into the drive shed, where they positioned themselves inside the shed's attic. From their vantage point through a hole in the ceiling, the 2 officers could clearly see the chest of drawers where the investigators had discovered the utility knife. They waited all night to see if Donald Moran would come to see if they'd found the evidence. According to court documents, things didn't go as they'd hoped. Quote, the following morning, Constable Bush saw Moran walk by the area where the plywood was in front of the chest of drawers and go to the workbench area. Moran then left but returned to the drive shed around 8:27 a.m. and stood underneath the hole in the ceiling through which Constable Bush was observing him. Moran felt around in the area of the hole where there... Matthew's laughing about somebody feeling around in a hole.
I'm just thinking of the movie Porky's.
Okay. Moran felt around in the area of the hole where there was space between the joists and the floor of the attic. He put his hand through the hole and felt around on the floor of the attic where the officer was standing. Stop it!
Then he returned with a flashlight.
Moran then left and returned with a flashlight, which he shone in the area of the space between the joists and the attic floor, which he commenced to... Oh, now you've got me going. When he commenced to climb the ladder, the 2 police officers jumped to the ground and ran across a field. Constable Bush testified that he never saw Moran make any attempt to look behind the plywood. You're still laughing.
Well, I'm just picturing the cops like, shit, run! They just took off. Just like, run! They didn't identify themselves.
Yeah, that doesn't make any sense.
They just ran. I'm sorry. This is a very serious case, but this scene just makes me laugh.
Yeah, it's weird. Oh, well. That same day, March 15th, 1985, Donald Moran was admitted to the Kingston Psychiatric Hospital, where Dr. Miller examined him. Donald Moran told Dr. Miller that he had attempted to drown himself. Moran told Dr. Miller there were problems relating to his girlfriend, whom he had known for about 14 years. She had been threatening suicide and claimed they had had a suicide pact since the fall of 1984. He said that she was dead and that he had been questioned and searched extensively over the past 2 days by the police concerning her death. In late April, the OPP had enough to arrest and charge Donald Philip Moran with first-degree murder in Betty Hart's death. He was arrested on his return to the hospital while out on a day pass. A preliminary hearing was scheduled for July. Moran's lawyers fought for and were granted a change of venue for undisclosed reasons, and proceedings were moved from Cobourg to Simcoe. Jury selection began in January 1986. According to the Brantford Expositor, quote, During the selection process, defense lawyer Witold Targon of Coburg asked each prospective juror, if the evidence should disclose that the accused person, a married man, had a secret affair with Betty for 14 years, would that information make it difficult for you to render a fair and impartial verdict? 6 men and 6 women were eventually chosen and would help to determine Moran's fate. The Crown presented its case, filling the Simcoe courtroom with police officers, forensic experts, pathologists, and other relevant witnesses. Dr. Whiteside gave dramatic evidence of his gruesome findings, followed by Dr. Hillsden Smith, another eminent forensic pathologist. Dr. Smith, basing his opinion on the post-mortem report and photographs, concluded that the injuries were not self-inflicted. He cited the number and severity of throat wounds, bruises, and abrasions indicative of a struggle and hand injuries consistent with defense wounds as evidence against suicide. However, he acknowledged that the throat wounds alone were not sufficient to rule out suicide. Evidence was given that Moran had purchased a box of utility knives at auction that matched that found to be the murder weapon, later discovered in the chest of drawers in his drive shed. Bryan Hart took the stand, along with other family members. Bryan testified that he didn't know Donald Moran as a violent man, and he said he'd had no reason to suspect him in Betty's death. From the Brantford Expositor, Hart said he was not aware his wife had an affair with Moran for 14 years, as the defense has told the jury. I not only wasn't aware of it, I still don't believe it, he said. However, Hart said he had known of his wife's affair with another man. For the defense, Dr. Jaffe, examining only the photographs, offered a more nuanced interpretation of Betty's post-mortem examination. He noted that some injuries, such as the wrist cut, were typical of suicide attempts. While the number of throat wounds suggested they might not be self-inflicted, Dr. Jaffe did not exclude this possibility. He also provided an alternative interpretation of the hand wounds, suggesting they could result from grabbing at a knife. Additionally, Dr. Jaffe explained that a cut windpipe could potentially allow speech if the wound were covered or the neck flexed, providing insight into Betty's potential actions before death, later claimed in Donald Moran's testimony. Dr. Miller, Moran's psychiatrist at the Kingston Psychiatric Hospital, testified that Donald claimed Betty had called him on the day of her death and said, "You won't stop me this time." He remembered getting into booze and walking toward her home. He said he did not remember anything after that until he remembered kneeling in his girlfriend's house and she was dead. Subsequently, he said he was depressed and upset. Donald Moran's words, as Dr. Miller wrote them down, were that, quote, he didn't know whether or not he'd killed her, but that he was afraid that he did, end quote.
Do you see how he keeps changing his story every time?
Yeah, it's all
over again. When he thinks they've grabbed onto something, he starts almost the negotiation of, oh, well, okay, you've caught me further down the road on this, so now I'm going to make up another lie, right?
Yep. Donald Moran's testimony painted a harrowing picture of his tumultuous relationship with Betty Hart, a woman whose life, according to him, seemed to teeter on the edge of tragedy. Their story unfolded like a dark, gripping novel, according to Moran, filled with moments of desperation and near misses with death. Moran's account began in 1978 when Betty Hart made her first shocking attempt to leap from his car as it hurtled down the road at 70 miles an hour. This wasn't an isolated incident. In 1983, Betty tried to jump out of the car again on the highway, with Moran barely managing to prevent disaster both times. But a chilling event in November 1984 truly highlighted the depths of Betty Hart's struggles. Moran claimed that he awoke from an alcohol-induced slumber in his car to a nightmarish scene. Betty Hart allegedly tried to end both of their lives by using a hose to connect the exhaust to the car's interior. The most crucial part of Donald Moran's testimony centered on the last 2 days of Betty Hart's life. On February 13, 1985, what started as an innocent lunch invitation took a dark turn. Over their meal in Port Hope, Betty Hart broached a disturbing subject: the payout of life insurance in the case of suicide. The day's events crescendoed with yet another attempt by Betty Hart to exit Moran's moving vehicle. Oh boy. Valentine's Day 1985 dawned with an air of foreboding. Moran, battling his own demons of depression and alcohol, received 2 pivotal calls from Betty Hart that day. The first seemed innocuous, a mention of a Valentine's gift left on her refrigerator. But the second call concerned Moran deeply. In that call, Betty Hart's words to Moran were laced with anguish and accusation. She claimed he no longer cared for her and ominously declared that this time he wouldn't be able to stop her from carrying out her threats to take her own life. The call ended abruptly with Betty Hart's screams and the harsh slam of the receiver serving as a chilling punctuation to their story. Donald said his heart raced as he approached Betty's house, his unanswered calls fueling his worry. Stepping inside, he called out her name, his voice echoing through the empty rooms. He removed his boots, carrying them as he searched the house, his concern growing with each silent room. Finally, he said, he found her on the landing leading to the basement. "You still care about me. You came," Betty said, her voice a mixture of relief and desperation. Donald said, "I warned you yesterday. If this happens again, we're done. You didn't get help. This is it." As he turned to leave, he said, Betty lunged forward, grabbing him. "You're not leaving," she cried, hurling his boots down the stairs and knocking over a plant. "I'm going to do it this time," she threatened. "I'm going to kill myself." She started down the basement steps, but Donald held her back. In the struggle, she scratched his hand, possibly with her necklace. Frustrated, Donald snapped, "Oh, who the hell cares? Go ahead and kill yourself." And he let her go. Betty's screams echoed from the basement. "If I can't have you, she won't either," she yelled, referring to Donald's wife. "I'm going to use the knife that you gave me." Donald descended the stairs, intending to retrieve his boots and leave. Betty stood with her back to him, muttering about her coffin. He noticed movement, but couldn't discern her actions. Thinking it might be another of her pranks, he callously remarked, "Betty, if you're going to cut yourself, do a good job, cut your goddamn throat." He said he didn't mean it. Betty dropped to her knees, and Donald, still not grasping the gravity of the situation, moved closer. Suddenly, he realized she might have a knife. He asked her to hand it over. "Get out or I'll cut you up too," Betty snarled, making a threatening gesture. He said he saw her with a knife and attempted to take it from her, resulting in a struggle. Moran managed to obtain the knife, but then saw blood and realized the severity of the situation. Moran claimed, quote, she said, "I'm not afraid to die. Remember the good times, Dawn. I always loved you." He heard a gurgling sound and he said, "What did you say, Betty?" And Moran said later that it was too late for a reply because Betty was gone. So I don't usually interject here. I usually leave that to Matthew or whatever co-host has been on the show. But what a load of friggin' malarkey this is. I had to read it the way I did. I just had to. I'm sorry. No, I'm not.
And it's so schlocky. Like it's so made up sounding as well. Dawn, I'll always love you. She did not say that. She did not do that.
No, she absolutely didn't.
Poor woman. He's just dragging her name through the mud after he kills her, right?
Bryan, her husband, even said he didn't believe that they were having a relationship. So, maybe they weren't. Maybe this was all in this guy's head, something that he'd wanted for years and finally approached her with it, and she said, "Go shit in your hat."
Maybe.
And then he killed her.
I didn't even think of that.
Donald Moran testified that in the aftermath, he then cleaned up, placing the knife, a towel, and his gloves in a shopping bag, which he then hid in his drive shed. He claimed he didn't inform the police due to confusion and his promise to Betty Hart to keep their relationship secret. Donald Moran addressed the utility knife found by the police in his drive shed, acknowledging its similarity to the one from Hart's house, but denied any knowledge of how it ended up there. He claimed that on the morning of March 15, 1985, he checked the hiding place in the shed ceiling, exactly where the 2 officers had been stationed, and found the items missing. He admitted to buying the utility knives, but claimed he'd given Betty 1 or 2 when she'd come to his house for eggs. He said the knife was one of those that Betty had used on herself. He had not brought a utility knife to Betty Hart's home. Donald Philip Moran, 47, was convicted. of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life with the parole eligibility set after 10 years of incarceration. That's pretty low. Subsequent appeals failed. In a 1994 Colborne Chronicle article, Betty Hart's daughter Michelle expressed her wishes for Donald Moran to remain behind bars. So I've already talked about my ideas about what his motive might be. So what about you?
Yeah, I didn't even consider that, right? I was just making an assumption that there was a relationship, and now you have me thinking maybe there even wasn't. But even if there was, right? This would be like the typical weak man being rejected and his ego not being able to handle it, right? So if she was having an affair with him, she probably realized, this guy's a moron. I want to move on with my life without him, to focus on her family. And, she's doing a lot of community work, right?
Yeah.
So even if she's probably making all the right decisions of getting on with her life and refocusing, but his fragile little ego couldn't handle it. And because you've thrown that into the mix, and I'm like, wow, interesting. Or she just outright rejected him and he couldn't handle it. So either way, right? So, if she was having an affair, I have no judgment for her on that, right? I don't care about that. That does not mean she deserved anything at all, right? And so who cares? But either way, it's this guy's little ego, right?
Yep. In the article mentioned above, Michelle said a life sentence should be a life sentence, and referring to Moran, she said, quote, "I think he's a time bomb waiting to go off. He's a model prisoner, a smooth actor. He's used the system to the fullest, just like he's used me to the fullest. He's played the game." Referring to the impact of Betty's murder on her family, Michelle said, "It's not like it used to be. It ruined our family." She said that her dad, Bryan, and her brother, Michael, were still living in the home where Betty had been murdered. Referring to her brother, Michelle said, "Michael was really close to my mother. So was I. My mother loved everybody, but it was really hard on Michael." She was hopeful a petition by neighbors would keep Moran in prison. She said pointedly, "The justice system doesn't work for the victim or the victim's family." Then thoughtfully, quote, "It's something you think happens in big cities, not small towns like Colborne. It could happen to you," end quote.
So I totally stand with Michelle on this. And good for her. Her mom died horribly at the hands of this guy.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, Mike. I'm not going to name the name, but you'd caught out in my notes on the script. I'd actually used the name of somebody else from an earlier episode that we've done. And that just shows how I internalize these things and get upset for the family members because I use somebody else's name. He's like, "You're thinking of this person." I'm like, "Oh my God, I was." And because I'd meant to write Michelle, I wrote somebody else's name because I think of them often, Yeah. It's, this stuff sticks with you and I.
I think about certain cases a lot. A lot. I don't want to go into why or what that's about, but
it actually starts feeling personal. Not to play a victim at all, because we're not, but just when you just tell these stories, you oddly become connected. It's weird. It's really weird. Yeah.
And that's it for Dark Poutine episode 337, Valentine's Day Nightmare: The Murder of Betty Hart.
That's right. It's time for voicemails. You can leave us a message at 1-877-327-5786 or 1-877-DARK-PTN. We'd love to hear from you. Let's see who called us this week.
Oh boy, here is our first voicemail, and it's our only voicemail this week. Call us, folks. Please call and say hello. Say go shit in your hat. Or tell us you love us.
Do a filibuster and read us your favorite recipe.
A filibuster? Yeah. You can only leave a 3-minute voicemail. We found that out last week.
And we will edit it.
Yes, exactly.
Hello. This is Catherine. I am originally from Barrier, BC. I was just listening to the Sasquatch podcast. I had some friends in Barrier that said that they had a Sasquatch around their house. They could smell it when it was around. It would look in their window and watch TV with them. We thought they were kooks, but you just never know. It's kind of cool. Well, you have a great day and go shit in your hat. Thanks.
So Sasquatch is in Barrier, BC, watching TV through the through the window.
What are they watching? Alf?
Maybe they're watching Alf. They could be watching a documentary of the Patterson-Gimlin film, which is the film that apparently shows Sasquatch in California. But, it's my cousin's on TV. I want to watch my cousin.
Or what's that other movie about that includes Sasquatch and Hitler?
Oh my gosh, that movie was so bad.
It was so bad. But, okay, you do you.
Yes, exactly. You do you. And thank you for calling us from Barrier.
Barrier.
Yeah, Barrier, BC. What do you think she does up there in Barrier, Matthew?
She does marine biology, and she's protecting the Great Barrier Reef.
But that's not in Barrier, BC. That's in...
Oh, that's what you think.
That's what I think. Yes,
Don't try to correct me, Michael.
That's exactly what I think. You are 100% correct. That's what I think. what I think. Like, oh no. Oh boy. Anyway. Well, thank you so much for your voicemail.
Michelle.
That's it for this week's voicemails. Again, you can leave us one at 1-877-327-5786 or 1-877-DARK-PTN. We'd love to hear from you, even if it is just to say hi and to tell us to go shit in our hats. If you're stumped for what to chat with us about, a quick story is welcome.
So first up, we have patrons. Our new patron this week is Michelle. Just Michelle. Michelle like Cher or Madonna Michelle. She doesn't have a last name, so we're going to stick with just Michelle. Yeah. So where is Michelle from, Matthew, and what does Michelle do?
Michelle is from Precious Corners.
Where is that?
It's actually just north of Cobourg, Ontario.
Okay, Precious Corners. That sounds like a nice place to live.
Yeah, and she sells precious things on the corner in the Precious Corner shop.
Precious things on the Precious Corner in the Precious shop. Okay. Very good.
Did I
Did you what?
Oh, never mind.
Okay, more editing. More editing.
No, you don't edit that. It's fine.
I have to edit it.
You don't have to edit that. You can just leave this in.
What?
I know.
Go shit in your hat. All right. Let's move on to Donut Money donors. Oh boy, Matthew. We do have a Donut Money donor. And that person's name is Melissa Antaya. And she sent us some PayPal donut money. And she says, "Hey, Mike and Matthew, just listening to your new episode 334 and love your shout out for Jim's Lunch. If you are in the area, I'll treat you to the daily special."
Yay.
Jim's Lunch. Where was that again?
Jimmy's Lunch. It's in Kitchener, Waterloo.
Oh, okay. Jim's Lunch in Kitchener and Waterloo. Yeah, that sounds... Well, it's actually Princeton, isn't it?
I don't know. No, it's Kitchener, Waterloo.
Kitchener, Waterloo. Okay, well, fair enough. Hopefully that's the right place and people will know where to go.
Just making stuff. No.
Don't make that
There's
up.
a Jimmy's Lunch in Kitchener, Waterloo, which I don't know if it's still there. But
Oh. Well, you know what?
What?
We do have another Donut Money donor. And that person sent us an Interac Donut Money donation. And her name is Denise Walker. And she says, "Donut dollars, but don't you dare use this for curlers or honey dips. Fucking yuck. Love to you boys, Denise in Stony Plain, Alberta."
Stony Plain.
Stony Plain. So what does Denise do there in Stony Plain?
She actually is an archaeologist.
She's an archaeologist in Stony Plain.
Yeah,
What is she looking for up there?
She finds old First Nations things like old arrowheads and things like that.
Oh, that's fun.
We used to find arrowheads all the time in the field behind our house when I was a kid.
I would love to find something like that. I have bought an arrowhead. I bought one when I was in Fort Saskatchewan.
Isn't it interesting, Mike? I didn't realize how lucky I was. I had a box of arrowheads that I'd found in the field behind my house.
That is super cool.
Old stone arrowheads. And sometimes this, I think Stony Plain made me think of it, sort of a sharpened stone that was used for scraping fat off of pelts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, we used to find them all the time around my house.
That's really, really neat.
Yeah.
Does your mom still live in the same place?
No, she just moved half an hour up to London from Strathroy.
Ah, okay.
And I think there's a subdivision behind the house.
Because I was going to say, I would love to go and explore.
And I think I probably found them all when I was a kid.
Yeah, fair
We
enough.
used to do things if we thought it was... the local museums have lots of arrowheads, but if we found other things, we'd take them to the museums and stuff. And
something fascinating, but just a little different.
Yep.
Like what? Pottery and things?
Yeah, and human remains.
Oh, good Lord.
Yeah.
You're supposed to call the police for those, Matthew, just so you know.
We did, but they were deemed to be old. So...
they call those historical remains.
Historical remains.
Yeah.
Probably gave them to the wrong place back then. I'd probably take them to the local
So
Yeah.
we got a message recently, and I want to end the show on this bit of a shout out. So Heather Sparrow, who is a member of the Umbriard, she is a caregiver. And she mentioned to me that she came to the podcast after finding my book, Murder, Madness, and Mayhem. So she found my book, which led her to the podcast. And she said what she did with my book was read it to the person who she
cares for. And
his name is JD. He's Indigenous. He's 22 years old, and they live on Vancouver Island. He loves true crime and hip-hop music. He would be really excited to hear you guys shout out to him on an upcoming episode, too. Well, how about this, JD? JD, we think you're awesome, and we're so grateful that you listen to the show.
And I hope he listens to early hip-hop. I love early hip-hop.
Like, don't push me because I'm close to the edge. I'm trying not to lose my head. It's like a jungle sometimes. It makes me wonder how I keep from going under.
Thanks for listening, JD.
Yeah, so, Grandmaster Flash was my jam back in the day. And then there was also a song called Freakazoids that I really liked. And we used to play it as opening music for our basketball team.
Fun.
So just look that up. Freakazoids. Yeah, really. F-R-E-K.
I got you going.
Freakazoids. Yeah. Oh, my goodness. Yeah, so you guys can hear me rap. Hear Mike rap on this episode of Dark Poutine.
Hip-hop, hippity-hop.
Hippity hop. So JD loves hip hop. Who do you think his favorite hip hop artist is, Matthew?
I think he really likes Run DMC.
Run DMC.
Yeah.
There you go. I do like some Run DMC. I was introduced to them when they did Walk This Way with Aerosmith.
If he's into early hip hop, so I'm not sure.
The hippity hops.
If you like hip hop, then you have to like Run DMC.
You do.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, Beastie Boys was even hip hop.
It was.
I like me some Beastie Boys too. Intergalactic, planetary, intergalactic.
He might like Public Enemy as well.
Well, I love Public Enemy. Fear of a Black Planet is so great. That's a really great album. So JD, if you haven't listened to Fear of a Black Planet by Public Enemy, check it out. My buddy Bennett, who used to live in our basement suite when we lived in Burnaby, he heard me playing Fear of a Black Planet one day, And he told me, Mike, you're the blackest white person that I know.
You're the whitest white person I know.
Oh, boy. Yeah. I don't, just because I listen to an eclectic mix of
You do
music.
listen to eclectic.
So thank you, JD. We really appreciate you. And
I wish you could play music on this show.
I wish we could play music too. So do you want me to rap again?
No. And neither does JD, 100%.
No.
Thanks to all our patrons and Donut Money donors, past and present, for your generosity. It helps to keep the show going. You can become a patron of Dark Poutine at patreon.com/darkpoutine. For a one-time donation, you can send us donut money via PayPal using our email address, darkpoutinepodcast@gmail.com. If you don't already subscribe to the show, it would mean a lot if you did. You can easily find Dark Poutine on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. If you haven't gotten yours yet, my book, Murder, Madness, and Mayhem, is available to order via a link on the Dark Poutine website. And speaking of darkpoutine.com, please check it out for show notes and other cool stuff. We'd appreciate it if you took the time to give Dark Poutine a like or a follow on Facebook and Instagram. Most importantly, thank you for listening, and tell your friends about us. Word of mouth is a powerful thing.
And that's it for this episode of Dark Poutine. So until next time, hippity hop. Don't forget to be a good egg and not a bad apple.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.